there were a couple of things. One, they called us coolies. So that was the terminology to insult people of Indian origin. And then they did an accent.
Welcome to the Global Indian Podcast, the world's greatest journey and the official platform for people of Indian origin. Because let's face it, we are everywhere. My name is Rajan, and on our weekly show, we plunge into the human experience of being a person of Indian origin, take a closer look at the countries we now call home, and tackle the issues you need to know more about. This is the world's greatest journey that will ultimately change the way you see the notion of Indianness to be, and importantly, our connection to each other. Every week, the team and I are joined by our guests, where we have open conversations about the 50 shades of brown that is our experience, and take a closer look at the issues close to their hearts. In this episode, we travel all the way down to South Africa to meet with a wonderful gentleman, Omar Essack. Now, we've all heard of, obviously, apartheid that took place in South Africa, and being Black History Month in most countries out there, we're all learning the hidden histories that have taken place across the globe. But one history we probably don't get taught in schools is the history of people of Indian origin in some of these countries, including that of South Africa. And what was it like to be one of us at this incredibly dangerous but also historically monumental time? Now, Omar's story is absolutely fascinating. Many people in South Africa know him as being a media mogul. He's obviously headed up some of the largest radio stations and platforms in the country. But not many people would know the story behind the success, about the time where the human form, the fragility in knowing who you were, was questioned, especially towards the end of this apartheid era. What would ensue here is a remarkable conversation that I think every member of the audience should be proud to be part of, but also equally importantly, a conversation that reflects some of the greatest voyages that we've all been through as a community and countries that we now call home. As always, these podcasts have been supported by our dear friends at ShareMe.com, the app for all your beauty, wellness and fitness needs. Now, if you'd like to find out more about the Global Indian series, you know what to do. Listen at the end of the program. There I can give you some pointers of where to go and how you too can find out more about the great work that we've been doing and how also you can get involved. I hope you enjoyed this session. It is a remarkable one, and it's an hour, 5 minutes, and do you know what? I just didn't have the heart to condense it down. It warrants every single minute of this. It's a historical text towards a side of history that we really don't know much about, and we need to change that.
And just move. Get up 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 and just.
When we learnt about the apartheid in the UK, we only learned one aspect of that. But you don't really realize what's it like to be a person of color, to be a person of Indian origin at that moment in time in South Africa. Now, you've had an illustrious career, obviously, you rose through the ranks in the media over there, you did exceptionally well. But your first beginning parts of that was just at the edge of this apartheid, where you just came into the media industry. I think for everybody else out there, your name may be synonymous with success, but you've got a very harrowing story of what it was really like for you, those feelings. Run us through, Omar. Tell us a bit about you. And what was it like at that moment in time for you?
Thank you, Rajan. It's you say harrowing, and sometimes I feel fortunate because I never had anybody killed. And there were many people in this country who fought against the apartheid forces, that saw people imprisoned. I had a cousin imprisoned. I saw people killed. But what I did experience was the psychological effects, the trauma of watching my father, who is an articulate, intelligent man, and how he behaved. You know, observation as a young child growing up in any society is your first method of learning. And when you watch your father cower and say sir and appear subservient, and you know, just his entire body language in the presence of people who are white, because of how in our country you were on the margins if you were not white. You were people like my father who'd seen his nephew being an activist and then put into prison. That was a chastening and very frightening experience for him. And it transferred to how he brought me up. He was constantly afraid of any time he heard that I was involved in any kind of activism as a young person, whether it was in school or university. He was very strict. And it was because of that experience he'd had, because of the experience he'd had with the 1940s when the riots happened. My father related a story to me about how in his mind, and in the mind of his brothers and the rest of the family, Indians were placed in suburbs, townships, in between. So it was Indians and people who were called colored were placed in between Africans, South African, black Africans, and white people as an early warning system. This is how he saw it. So in other words, if indigenous people from this country decided to fight back and rioted, for example, they would attack Indian and colored areas, which would give white people enough time to prepare or to leave. I mean, it was a shocking, this is how he described, we were shock absorbers. That's how he painted the picture to me.
It's so almost like a canary, isn't it?
Correct. It was quite scary to hear that. But then, like I say, the observation of just watching him and his behavior. And so that becomes a learned behavior, that these people are different, these people are to be respected, these people are superior. And so that's how you grow up. And throughout your childhood in apartheid, you are surrounded only by others like you, brown people. So your experiences are, you're very comfortable in that zone. That's how it's meant to be. That's those are the restaurants you go to. Those are the cinemas you go to, if you're fortunate. All of that, as a lower middle class family, when I was growing up, my father was unemployed. But your experience is entirely contained in this bubble. And so you don't experience or encounter or engage with black people, and the same with white people. And then as you grow, and then you first start to venture out, so you go to the beach. And I remember these incidents of petty apartheid. One of the ones that stick with me is we were big fans of radio. My mom, dad, and I, we were in the 70s. Radio was our primary form of entertainment. So we would listen every evening to this public service radio station that had different types of drama and comedy and so on. So we would listen to Squad Cars. There was something called Jet Jungle, which was a sort of local superhero, all white, of course. And then there was Father Dear Father, some of it imported from the UK and then just rebroadcast in South Africa, but with South African radio actors. And my mom called in because we loved this one show, Father Dear Father, and they were always advertising live tapings. And so my mom called in, and our surname's Essack. And Essack, ours is E-S-S-A-C-K, but Essack, I-Z-A-K or I-S-A-K is a very common Afrikaans name. So she called in and she said she wanted 3 tickets for a live taping. And she gave the surname. She didn't spell it. They must have spelled it, probably in the Afrikaans way. But anyway, we got all dressed up, super excited. My father, couldn't believe that we were, he was so excited, so glad that my mom had done this. So we dressed up. I was off to school, showered, changed, spruced up. And then we got there to the SABC. And we didn't really notice much about the fact that we were the only brown people there. But we get to reception and she asks for the tickets. And the lady looks up at her and says, I'm sorry, there are no tickets here for you. And she says, yeah, but I called and you confirmed. And she says, no, there are no tickets here for you. And we turned around devastated and went back home. And when you reflect back on that, at the SABC, this was in Durban, the South African Broadcasting Corporation, which was the only radio operator in the country. It was because they must have written our names as if we were Afrikaans people. My mom didn't have a pronounced accent of any type, so she didn't make it out over the phone. And when we arrived, this wasn't for us. So it was devastating to turn away as a young kid. I'm not sure what's going on. Why? What? My mom, and of course I blamed my mom initially. Well, what happened? Why did you mess this up? And my father sat me down and said, in all likelihood, this is because they didn't realize over the phone that we were Indian people. They must have thought we were white because of our surname. So it's little incidents like that, and then compounded as I grow up and I'm becoming more aware of my place in this society. Walking down the beachfront pier in Durban, and this would have been in the late 1980s. So things was already, we were in a state of emergency. They were clamping down on media. They were, newspapers came out that were redacted because they couldn't talk about the violence that was happening in the townships around us, where people were being killed because they were protesting. But like I said, I didn't experience that harsh, violent, not that level of violence. I'll tell you about the university experience just now, because there certainly was violence, but just the petty stuff that we did has a profound psychological impact on a growing person. And we were walking, my girlfriend and I, who's now my wife, Regina, she's an Indian Catholic. So from the South, her family, we're all third generation. Her family comes from the South, which is Catholic, Tamil Nadu. And we were walking down the pier, and they were holding hands, and there were a group of white boys walking up towards the back of the pier. They're probably surfing, so they jump off the pier. And as they passed by us, there were a couple of things. One, they called us coolies. So that was the terminology to insult people of Indian origin. And then they did an accent. So a lot of us growing up in Durban, which is, as you might know, one of the largest concentrations of Indians outside the continent. I'm not sure if it still is, but at one point it's a city of over a million Indian people of Indian origin.
Absolutely huge, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And so, over time, the way Durban Indians speak is very different from the way Johannesburg Indians speak. And it has a particular lilting, rhythmic, musical quality, which can be quite funny. It's Russell Peters, the comedian, makes fun of how people of Indian origin speak, and how you can never be, you can never control the world if you were a person of Indian origin. The moment you spoke to the United Nations and said, "I have a vision," everybody would just burst out laughing rather than take you seriously. But anyway, it's quite a comical. It's also sort of an accent that people make fun of.
Yeah.
And that's what happened. So they started, imitating the accent while we walked by, and called us coolie. And the only retort I could have is a ridiculous, trivial, trite retort. I don't speak like that, is what I said. And we just kept walking. But that way of teasing you, taunting you, is meant to undermine you, meant to undermine your confidence. It does, meant to make it clear to you, you're second class. This is not a place where you don't belong here. You're the other. And it's very difficult when you're a young person growing up in that sort of, like I said, it's pretty tortuous, but it's all contained in here.
Absolutely,
So
it's very mental,
You don't spend time, we don't have the money to go to therapy to talk about these sorts of things. That was not how we dealt with that sort of thing. You just needed to suck it up. And
but this was all prior to the end of the apartheid, wasn't it? So what was it like? Was it only that way inclined towards the white South African community, or also was it similar instances with the black South African community?
I never experienced during my youth, and there was much more comradeship. So when I went to university, where there was quite a bit of violence, so young 18, 19-year-olds who were, it was an Indian university, but it did have some level of mixing. So it's the first time I saw black students, and there were black students in the classes that I attended. And there were very few white students, but because there was this university, Durban Westville, which is the Struggle University in Durban. This is the university that had an optometry course. So therefore, white people who wanted to study optometry got special permission to come to the Indian university, as it were. But there was very little interaction with them. You saw them in the corners, and they were a very small minority, but you didn't interact with them much. So I didn't have much of an encounter with Black people, even as a young student at university. I did have the encounter with the special branch, as many of us did, which was the
what is a special branch?
Special branch is the apartheid's blunt instrument to identify activists in the community, whichever community, and then to intimidate and threaten them. And so there was
these guys were quite brutal, weren't they? The special branch then from okay.
Absolutely, and there were spies around. They had students at university, some of whom were targeted, and I don't know how they were influenced, but we always knew that there were students among us who would be spying on us and providing that information.
Just to put this in perspective, which year was this?
This would have been between 1985 and 1988, which is when I was at
not too long ago. Yeah, so in the bigger picture of things, I think that's something that the audience probably need to realize, that this isn't too long ago, that this is happening. Yes. This is stuff that we heard about possibly when we associate towards like former Yugoslavia or even further back from there, but this is in 1980s. So special branch at university, what happened?
So because this was the time that there was the state of emergency, when there was, P.W. Botha was the president of the country, brutal, very committed to quashing all types of protest, activism. And I must be clear, I'm no hero and I wasn't an activist. I was caught up. There were people I'm very proud of who are still my friends, who put themselves on the line. I worked, I used the soft, soft protest, let's call it that. I worked for the campus radio station. So that's where the love of media and radio grew. And then on specific dates, like June 16th, the radio station would generally played, all of the best 80s stuff, Duran, Simple Minds, whatever it was that we were doing. We would suspend all of that on June 16th to play protest songs. But we were that particular studio where we worked was part of the Student Representative Council building. And the SRC were where the real activists were, the ones who were planning and thinking about how to consistently make it clear to all of us what we were facing in this country and how we needed to rise up to expose what we were facing and to act against it. And so I witnessed, as a radio DJ on the campus radio station, directly young people my age dragged by special branch because they were identified by some of those spies out of that studio area, that area where we all were, at gunpoint with a gun cocked at his head. Dragged out. I witnessed the police in their big, they were called Casper vehicles at the time. They were big vehicles that transported soldiers to the campus, and they would put barbed wire around the campus. And then what they would do is, if we were marching and protesting and singing, songs of the revolution, they would spray water cannon with purple dye. And the purpose of that was, once you scattered and you ran to hide, they would then come and scour the university. And if you had a T-shirt that had purple stain on it, then you were beaten up. So, that's what we faced in the 1980s. But again, I want to be very clear. For me, I really was sort of caught up in the moment, but there were people, many of my peers, who were the real heroes, who stood up, who risked jail, some of whom did go to jail, some of whom I taught with subsequently. I remember one young woman my age who subsequently taught with me in my first teaching post in Escort, which is about 2 hours outside Durban. She went to prison for her activities. Young woman doing the right thing, devastating, and I think their scars compared to the sort of mental scars that I talk about, what would be far deeper, far greater because of what they had to face. So it was really a very, very difficult time. And, out of that, when things normalize, and really you've got to put normalize in big inverted commas, just because finally Mandela is released in 1990, I'm a teacher at this stage, working first in a school in Escort, and then transferred down to work in a school in a very poor Indian township called Phoenix, where you'll remember in the Ella Gandhi episode, you talked about the Phoenix settlement where Mahatma Gandhi had, the trust and the buildings. So I worked there for a little while. And to be honest, it was in my professional career as a teacher where I became more of an activist than I was at university, very, very keenly supporting the integration of schools, allowing people from black townships around Phoenix to come into the Indian schools because they were better resourced. They had, qualified teachers, they had better facilities, etc. But that movement from university, the fact that Mandela was freed, all this euphoria of, this new nation, this rainbow nation that's being built, none of that, we had the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but none of that actually deals with the deep scars that so many people who were black and brown experienced. It just doesn't take care of that. So it's and I think that's what sometimes we forget, that when we look at South Africa today and you talk about that transition and you talk about the fact that people just said, well, you've got the vote, so what now? What are you complaining about? It just doesn't turn like that. If you've spent 10, 15, 20 years of your young life being made to feel like a second-class citizen, teased, sometimes brutalized, but all that psychological pain, all of that deeply embedded trauma that, like I said, you never had a chance to talk to anyone about. You needed to suck it up. You can't turn that around. That must have an impact in the society that emerges afterwards. Absolutely. And even as your first encounters with white people, and that's the part of the story I'm going to get into now. How do you behave when you get your first gig through public audition? I auditioned to be on radio, and this is a funny story because we all had black people and brown people all had media that was specifically created for them. Just like they had cinemas and restaurants and townships and residences, everything. This was separate development, the perfect architecture of apartheid. Everything that you want to do as a brown person, there are places for you as a brown person, there are places for you as a black person, and there are places for you as a white person, including newspapers and radio stations and television channels, etc. So everything was choreographed to be, well, you have to be there. That's your place in society. And so while I'd started teaching, I'd always had through university this passion for radio. But the only opportunity to get into radio, well, there were two. There was an independent radio station that came out of the UK and had a whole lot of UK presenters called Capital Radio that was located in a Bantustan, in a separate development area that was specifically made for black people to have their own country called Transkei. There were few of them, but they said, here's a piece of land, you run it, it's all yours. The apartheid government will give you money, but it's like this enclave, and it's just for you. So go run it, have your own leaders, etc. It was like a big concession, supposedly to make black people who were the originators and indigenous to this land, this entire country, that's your little piece of, go work there. And often it was in barren parts of South Africa. So anyway, that's where you needed to be. And so there was this Capital Radio. And then there was Radio Lotus, which was for Indian people. And so I tried out at Capital Radio, didn't get anywhere. So I thought, well, the next option for me is Radio Lotus, right? That's the Indian radio station, but it's they have lots of Indian music. Now, I'm a Gujarati in terms of my heritage and background, but I spoke it exclusively until I was 4 years old. And then my father forced me into cold turkey. because he knew I had to go to school, and in school I'd have to speak English.
And he
here
wanted
was a
you
boy
to
who-
integrate. Yeah.
Exactly, and not a word of English at 4 years old. So
Yeah.
suddenly, here I was speaking to my parents, and they would look at me blankly, as if they didn't understand what I was saying. It's the worst kind of cold turkey that you can have. And I had to start learning English words, to which they would then respond. As I spoke English, then they would respond.
Yeah.
And that's how I had this force feeding of English words. And by the time I got to school, I had started speaking it. And I was
And you're quite fortunate for backstory for the audience, because you had relatives, I believe, in the UK. So your accent as well in English sounded rather more British than it did the South African English.
Yes, I didn't speak. Yes, I never did speak English the way a lot of my peers did, because I'd had that benefit of my uncle, who lived in the UK and his tragic story, he came down to die. He had cancer.
Yeah.
So he was at home all the time, and my mom and dad, it was sort of an extended family. So they lived in the same house with my gran,
Yeah.
and this uncle of mine, his brother, who'd come down. So while my father was working, my mom was very young. She was a 17-year-old. So, and she had to sort of, cook in the kitchen with her mother-in-law. And so my uncle pretty much had me on his lap all the time. And he would be playing with me while he was waiting to pass on. So that probably was the influence. But in any case, I couldn't go and be a music continuity presenter at Lotus, because all the songs were in Hindi or Tamil, and I couldn't speak the language anymore, and I couldn't get the accent right for Hindi or Tamil back announcing, right? So they would definitely not understand me. It would sound ridiculous and out of place. So I said to, and because I wanted so desperately to get back into radio, I said to the guy who was running it, the programming guy, could I not do news? Because news is entirely in English.
Yeah.
Could I not do news? Because I really want to get into radio. So I went for the audition to be a newsreader on Radio Lotus, and I did it. I thought I'd practiced and rehearsed and all of that, and I thought I'd done a fairly good job. And after I'm done, he comes out to me and says, "They're not going to understand you." This audience is going to reject you because you don't have this authentic Durban Indian sound.
Absolutely.
So it was a devastating blow, because that was my only shot, I felt, to get back into radio. But as I was walking out of those studios, they were all in the SABC. Here's the irony. Remember, I was rejected from going to the SABC as a tenor. And here I was trying to get back into the SABC. And in the Indian section of the SABC, they just turned me down.
Yeah.
So I saw a notice that said that to put it bluntly, white pop music radio station called Radio Port Natal was looking for new presenters. And this was 1990. So things were starting to change. Remember, Mandela had been freed.
Yeah.
And so obviously maybe they were looking for some diversity. I wasn't sure, but I put my name down. After leaving depressed from the Lotus audition, put my name down. I didn't think anything would come of it at all, and I just went back home, and then obviously the next day back to my teaching job. And a couple of weeks later, I got a phone call to say, you put your name down to audition for our radio station. Will you come over? And they gave me a date and a time, and I said, look, I can only do it in the afternoons because I'm a teacher. And they said, fine. And I went over. And I did this audition, obviously terrified. Again, I'm surrounded by white people now for the first time. Because obviously the Lotus thing, I was surrounded.
Absolutely, and you would have had that conditioning as a youngster, seeing the stuff when the guys were surfing, your father's attitude, and now you're there auditioning for a job that you really want in an industry that you deeply care for, but you got all this backlog telling you, I don't fit in here, this isn't me, or you're scared to be who you are. So what happens? You take the audition, then
you're walking in with all this baggage, exactly the point.
Absolutely.
And it's really challenging. So how can you present yourself authentically? How can you be the real you? It's not easy. So walking in there, you're always thinking, what do they want from me? How should I present? How should I be in front of them? I mean, that's always sort of at the back, not even on the back of your mind, it's the front of your mind. front and center. Anyway, there were a whole lot of general knowledge questions. Fortunately, my general knowledge was good, so I answered all of those. And then I had to do a couple of links for, I think it was a Madonna song at the time, and I tried to put in a quip. I remember how dry my mouth was, but you're not allowed to drink any water. You have to go through this in one take. And I did it. I did the whole audition. I think the one question, the one question I still remember, and I still don't know why they asked these, because you're going in to do music continuity. But one of the questions was, what's the capital of Madagascar? And it was Antananarivo, and I got it right. I don't know why I knew that. Must have remembered my school geography or something. But I don't know whether that sort of swung it in my favor. But as you leave that audition, again, it's sort of like you've just had a shot at it, but you have no expectations. Because like I said, this is the white radio station. And so I went back home and I told my wife about it, and whatever will be, will be. We just went back and carried on my job as a teacher. And a couple of months later, got a call at the school, and they said, you've been successful, and we want you to come and spend 6 months observing. So
wow.
After school, come in and observe, watch our presenters at work, and let's see where that gets you. So it wasn't a gig. It was, okay, so you've made it through the first hurdle. Now come and watch, and then let's see what happens. And that's how essentially my radio career started. I was so nerdishly silly going in, because I would take this classic teacher thing. I would take this thick notebook with my pen, and I would write down everything the presenter I'm watching is doing. Okay, she put that up, and this is what she said. I wrote it down bookishly like a nerd for like months. And then finally they gave me my first gig in a show where I couldn't destroy the radio station. Sort of, it's a weekend, late night.
But what was it like for you at that moment? You're going in, you're the first person in your community that's working for this station. So this is a rather big thing. I know we're talking about it in a trivial matter, but in South African point of view, this was huge. It's the first time you have a person of color, person of Indian origin that's working for a station, that's going in there. And apartheid hadn't fully ended. Would that be correct? So
yes,
we're still in a form of apartheid. We still got the ignorance out there. We still got the looks. We still got the comments that are being made. And psychologically, you're almost entering into the other's environment on a day-to-day basis. What was that like for you?
So very nerve-wracking, very unnerving. It was easy being in the studio with the one person just writing notes, right?
Yeah.
That wasn't difficult. But I remember the thing that had the biggest impact on me was when I went in the first day. Everybody wears the Radio Port Natal t-shirt.
Yeah.
Everybody's got a Radio Port Natal cap. And everybody has a locker, an open locker, where information is left for them with their name on it. And yes, I was just a freelancer when I, sort of been given my show. But I remember how hurt I was when I walked in and nobody knew who I was. There was no t-shirt for me. It sounds silly, it sounds trivial, but there was no t-shirt, there was no cap, and there was no special locker with my name on it.
Because you already feel you're an outsider, and this is compounds that even further, saying, well, you don't belong to the team. You haven't even got the t-shirt. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that had quite an impact on me. Obviously, when the newspapers started asking, and it was the Indian newspapers again, obviously, who were first to say, okay, we want to profile this boy because it's a big thing, like you say, for this, it's the first brown person to work at this white radio station, as it were. So then, obviously you need the t-shirt for the photograph, and then it was all provided, and I had good media from the Indian Post newspaper, and then there was a Weekend Herald newspaper, which is part of the biggest Sunday newspaper. I had good coverage, front page, etc. That was all great. But I can tell you that this not having the t-shirt moment became a very, very powerful, pivotal moment for me when I eventually ran the radio station. Because
how many years later was that you actually took on the custodianship of this national platform?
It's a regional. This is a regional radio station that covers KZN, KwaZulu-Natal province. So I got in as a freelancer in 1990. I left teaching permanently at the end of 94 to take on a full-time job with the radio station in 95. Yeah. Prior to that, I was just doing sort of fill-in shows and weekend shows. And then I got a full-time gig in 95. It was exactly the time that my first, 94 was, sorry, it was 93, 94. And my first baby, Hannah, was born on the 30th of April, 3 days after we voted for the first time as free South Africans.
Wow.
It was momentous. It's absolutely momentous moment and momentous occasion. And I remember having, the ANC t-shirts and the ANC caps in my house. And I remember talking to this little newborn tiny thing and just showing her those pictures and saying, that's our freedom. You're born free in this country. You will never have to face what I did. You will be able to go and eat wherever you want to, watch movies wherever you want to, go to any beach you want to, interact with anyone you want to. And that was very powerful for Hannah. Well, just growing up with her, knowing that she had that.
Yeah, absolutely.
We would never, we didn't have that to experience. And hopefully, because of that, her shackles, her mental shackles, they wouldn't be there, unlike they were for people like myself and Regina and obviously my parents. And that meant greater hope for her, greater sense of security, less marginalization. That's what you dream of. But if you were to speak to Hannah today, she's 25 and she's a doctor working at Critics Care Hospital. And my second daughter, Zara, is 15. Hannah's experience wouldn't be as markedly different as I would have expected it to be, because she still experiences elements of distance from people. Not to the same extent that we did, where people jumped out of swimming pools when we jumped in, which happened to us, incidentally. That's an incident I forgot to recount to you, but I remember going for the first time. This was now after the vote.
Yeah.
Right? So now we were a free country. We went to a holiday resort called Margate down south, about 2 hours away from Durban South. And, we booked, no problem, yes, right of admission is reserved.
Yeah.
But they accepted our, this was a free country now. You couldn't turn us down. But I remember when we all got into our swimming gear and went down to the pool before we went to the beach. And literally, as we jumped into the swimming pool, me and a couple of friends, we were all, from the school that I taught in at the time. And all the white people in the pool jumped out instantly. So, that's the sort of, those things continue to have an impact on you. You're not good enough. What's wrong? Are you dirty?
Absolutely.
Is that why nobody wants to be in the same...
But did we ever know what the reaction was from them? Because they too are young. They're still in this fragile form. They don't actually have the full understanding. So ignorance is still there. What was their thinking? How did they see you to be? How did they see the Black South African to be?
Yeah, you're right to say that, because obviously one only thinks about one's own vulnerability, fragility, and emotional reaction to that.
Absolutely.
But on the other side, I would be very clear that there must have been fear.
Yeah.
It has to be fear.
Yeah.
Fear because you're losing your place where you had everything belonged, all the best of everything belonged to you as a white person.
And on top of that, you would have had politicians that would play into that fear. Let them be there, because if they come close to you, they will attack you, they will murder you, they will kill you, they will rape this. And so then you're sitting there and you're thinking, oh wow, how we just let the terrorists through the door type of mentality. Not that I'm excusing it, but I'm just thinking, what's it like for them? Because South African, the experience of South Africa, that rainbow nation, obviously you're right. There's so many lines that were drawn psychologically within people. It's so difficult just through a vote to unwind it all. So
exactly.
These guys jump out. You're there, free South Africa. Then
not much changes, right? Except that you can now go wherever you want. You You can send your kids to schools that were previously reserved. But in terms of real crossing the racial barrier, do you make friends? Are you
No.
fully comfortable with each other? Absolutely not.
No.
It's a long road, and it's a long road for both parties, right? Because on the one side, even if there are, and there are, of course, many white people who fought with the ANC, were part of the struggle, who genuinely, are not racist. Absolutely. For those ordinary people, what occasion would there have been to reach out and perhaps face some of their peer group looking at them, right?
Absolutely.
So there's obviously that to consider. But I mean, for people like me and my contemporaries, coming into that environment was difficult. And like I just said, I see it from my perspective, but if I put myself in their shoes, they didn't know much about me either.
No.
They knew nothing about me. What kind of people are these? Funny story. I ate with my hands like all Gujarati people do, with naan and a good gravy and curry, right?
Yeah.
So the first time eating with a knife and fork, I remember my even worse for my dad, right? I could learn quicker. But when we were having to go now for the first time ever to a good restaurant that we'd never gone to before, it actually became impossible for somebody like him. It was just too uncomfortable, which meant he never wanted to go again, because he now had to use cutlery and he'd never done it before. And it's, what the hell do I do with this?
Yeah.
So things don't just transition. I have to educate myself around habits that I didn't have and ways of being that I didn't know in order to fit in. But I feel, when I think about this journey, that over 20 years now of freedom, people should never say, you've got your vote, so what do you want next? There has to be a responsibility among those who previously had all the power, all the authority, to make an effort to say, what change do I need to bring to make this interaction productive and constructive?
Absolutely. And it has to be thought through. No, you're right, because I think what happens, it's so easy to play identity politics, isn't it? Is the easiest way to get about. I think a classic example for you guys with that is with the gentleman Julius Malema. I know we spoke about it before. He'll stand up on stage and he'll say things that'll be absolutely outrageous because he knows that is the void that he's trying to fill. But I think you mentioned a great statistic to me that although Julius Malema is openly, in want for a better word, ethnically biased, you're saying, well, he hasn't got the majority. In fact, his voting pool is starting to go further and further down. Would that be correct? So then you hear that, but then you've got these guys that are playing it on both sides, that they are rigging it. Here's a question for you then, Omar. I know right at the beginning, everyone had their place for media. This is the grand architect of apartheid. If you are brown, you consume brown media. If you're black, you consume black media. If you're white, you have white media. But what's happening now? Because we've got more of a proliferation of identity medias than ever before. We've got, if you're brown, it's which shade of brown do you want to be? And I got 500 channels to entertain that shade of you for that moment in time. Forget one day a week is one day an hour. And likewise, if you're black, whichever tribe you belong to, I have a station here, and you can in fact buy the t-shirt to represent it as well. And likewise, so do you think we've almost come full circle in the fact that we think that we've become more liberalized, but in fact we're conditioning ourselves to be even more separated than before?
I think that's very complicated in our country right now. So these indigenous language stations, we've always had them for people who speak Zulu, isiZulu, isiXhosa, various other indigenous languages. We've always had them, stations for Afrikaans, for people who treasure their language. But if I look at the radio stations where I worked and which I eventually ran, we made a very conscious effort to break out of our stereotype. And I know that for example, at East Coast Radio, that conscious effort was driven by a mission on my part when I became the head of that radio station. It wasn't just for, it was the right thing to do commercially, but that wasn't the first thing on my mind. The first thing on my mind was, this is music. This is a music radio station.
Yeah.
People who love songs and music and want to have fun, regardless of their race, should feel comfortable here.
Yeah.
But you have to consciously reach out, because everybody had an impression, that's the white station. Why should I go there? I have my brown station, I have my black station. But you reach out. And that's the point, right? This reaching out. It's the same thing I was talking about earlier. The responsibility is not, just put up a billboard or say, hey, grow up, man. You've got the vote. So just integrate. Why should I make any effort? You actually do, because if you're in the position of power and if you're in the position of authority, and if you can put yourself in my shoes and know what I've been through, then it's important to make the effort to say, welcome. We're comrades. This is our country. And I'm sorry, that apology is necessary. People don't think it is, but it is. It's critical. What's the, let me go to your question now. What about the situation now? Are we more polarized than we've ever been before? It's hard to answer that. But what I can say is over 20 years of freedom, democracy, and the vote has been wasted in some ways, because what you needed to do, what this country needed, what we all needed, was to see people pulled out of poverty.
Yeah.
Given good education so that they can achieve something. We needed to pull the massive people out of poverty, and we haven't. And that poverty creates the alienation. So it's a class struggle.
Yeah.
More than simply a race struggle now. There are black people my daughter goes to a school that's very integrated. It's a private school. The vast majority of people, young people in that school, are black. Most of the teachers are still white, but the vast majority of students are black. So it's black middle class. Part of that black empowerment experiment has been good, but a lot of it has been bad, because it's
created a falsehood, hasn't it? Because you're saying
well-networked people who are, the ugly part of it is those who were connected with the right people and the right politicians benefited the most. And that's not the intention. So a lot of the ideals, the great vision that the ANC had for how this country needed to change and how people needed to be brought out of poverty, has been ruined and hurt by corruption. And that's a fertile ground for populists.
Yeah.
So if the ANC had done what it committed and promised and had met its vision and its plan, we would be better off. But why are we not where we should be? Poor leadership. And that poor leadership has meant that poor people have become poorer. Struggle is worse.
Is it down to the leadership, or is it down to the personal responsibility of the people? Because it's quite easy to take a backseat, Omar, and say, okay, great, you're the leader, we're going to follow you, we voted you in, you now take care of my life. But the reality is, we all know, if you look back in history, it's never been that simple before. So now everybody has to equally say, what role am I going to play in society? And what decisions am I going to make, like you did? You said, well, I had to face my demons. I had to say, let me rid myself of these little scars in my mindset and say, do you know what? I too matter. I am good enough. And so there's almost a certain amount of apologies that the government can provide, but there's also about part of it that's down to the individual to say, you know what? I need to make this work for my children or for my community or just for myself. So how much can we really put on the leadership, and how much can we put the onus onto the individual? God, we're getting rather philosophical, aren't we, on here?
But I think it's a good point you make, Rajan. This is what when I think of this, leadership has the responsibility of, through policy, creating the right environment
Yeah.
for things to change. So I don't expect, leadership to give people handouts. But what I do expect is if you are going to craft a better education system to give people the opportunity to claw their way out of poverty.
Make sure the policies and procedures are in place that benefits all. Yeah, absolutely.
So that's where the rubber hits the road. It's policy, not just the writing and the crafting of it, but the execution of it.
Absolutely.
And the execution is people, right?
Yeah.
It's people across the administration in the organization who say, we know what needs to be done to create, and then it goes down to teachers. Are teachers doing their work or are they lazy? And if they're lazy, what are you doing to keep them accountable? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, at the heart of all of this, at the heart of helping people crawl out of misery and poverty is a good schooling system. It's good education, that people are inspired, that they're dedicated teachers. And where those things do exist, we see great stories, but they're too few and far between. Too few and far between. That is the problem. So yes, you're right. You can't blame everything on leadership. And there are many examples. My wife is a PhD in maths education, far smarter than I am. She's done work in the poorest schools in Johannesburg. And she's found phenomenal examples of extraordinary teachers and amazing examples of people with the worst conditions, living in a shack with no electricity, but such a committed and dedicated child that they will score A's, the top marks in mathematics and physics, and they'll make something of themselves. So yes, there is absolutely a part of how does each individual drive themselves to change their condition. But that's not how it works for the mass of people. Most of us are lazy. We need a helping hand. And excellent policy supported by investment and the right people does make a difference. When you can roll that out to schools across this country.
I suppose what's interesting, Omar, because you're speaking, I can hear it. I think the audience can hear it from a very truthful, authentic place. You can feel the rarity based upon the experiences that you had, because you're saying, actually, look, this is what I went through. But I also appreciate we need to have a more integrated society. We need to do more, because I saw it. I grew up with it. I saw my father's reaction from the visuals of going to a restaurant, not feeling that they belonged, through to you going into the radio station and all of the things in between. And then obviously your career ladder, which has been spectacular. You know, you have headed up some of the largest medias in South Africa, starting from just prior to apartheid, being scared to go in and having to be fearful, walking on eggshells, through to actually setting up the Rainbow Station, you know, where you are bringing people together in such a powerful way. But here's a question for you. Out of all of that, there's still a lot of fear that you attach towards something. What's your biggest fear for your country of South Africa?
Probably that despite having the vote, we've never truly become free. We've got still perceptions in our minds about the other that create suspicion, that create fear, that then is articulated through anger and pointing fingers. So not an outstretched open hand among us as people, but a clenched fist with a finger pointed. It's your fault.
But that's between all ethnicities though, isn't it? It's not just...
Yeah, that's right. That's my biggest fear, is that we are not a fully integrated society.
No.
20 plus years into a democratic South Africa where we have the vote, the franchise. But integration is limited. I thought, so my dream for my daughter and for my daughters was that they will be in schools where they would be surrounded by South Africans, black, brown, white. And therefore, the future would be rosy because that suspicion of the other would be diluted because of familiarity.
Yeah.
I'm dealing with, every day, I have a best friend who's black, I have a best friend who's white, and so my suspicion disappears. And I don't think that's happened in a lot of cases. So yes, there is some level of mixing, but this is happening in private schools. The vast majority of black students go to schools that are entirely black only. They don't have any encounters with white and brown people. They don't. So they're in the situation I was in still, and that's the vast majority. So there's this tiny minority of privilege, like my daughters, who go to a school that's integrated, and they're encountering people, and that's why I bring this class issue up. The people who can afford to send their kids to the school, they're in good jobs, they're professional people.
Yeah.
So you're interacting at a particular level with people who are at a particular economic status.
Yeah.
But the vast majority are still in all black schools.
Because it's not just about income inequality, then it's talking about
Of course
cultural
it is.
inequality.
That's why I spoke earlier about policy. And you know, if you ran the economy, this is a rich country from a, you know, rich in minerals.
Yeah.
If you have the right policies that encourage investment, and you are able to spread that wealth by bringing people out of poverty through good education and whatever other means. But we haven't been able to do that. And yes, you're right, we all have a personal responsibility. Our corporates and our leadership have a responsibility to do that. But that the fact that we haven't reached that nirvana, we haven't reached that place where I can look at the other and say, I completely can, I can be in your skin. I understand your situation.
Having empathy.
I don't, because so many people live in shacks today. I can't say that I understand their pain and their fears and their ambitions and their hopes. And we have this horrible crime situation that again creates greater suspicion, greater fear. You know, so you're looking over your shoulder. Who are you looking at? Who are you looking for? I mean, do you keep your bag tighter when you see somebody who looks like a poor black person next to you? Is that a racist action? I mean, so we're still grappling with all of this. And, you know, had we been able to, you know, I look at the US. Here's a very wealthy country. And we know systemic racism exists. With all of their advantages, they haven't been able to conquer this.
I suppose that's the interesting part, because again, we all have to take action. The biggest issue that I have, Omar, that when we look at this is the fact that we start to fraction ourselves even more. So rather than coming together, and culture is great, identity is great. It's a wonderful thing to be proud of. This is my perception of my reality based upon my ancestors, wherever it may be or whatever it may be. But the problem is when we start fighting for just one subgroup, but not rather fighting for the entire communities coming together, that's when the dangers come through, because all that happens is the coin gets reversed. I think there's a great quote, I think it's from Rajesh Gopi in South Africa. He said, in South Africa, it's almost strange being a person of Indian origin, because you're not white enough to be on one side, you're not black enough to be on the other, and you're caught in the middle. And because you're caught in the middle, you have that crisis, I'm paraphrasing, and you think, that's really interesting. And then if we take that up abroad and we say all the countries that we are now, in places like Fiji, Malaysia, that's been seen as having this reverse, you know, Malaysia's for Malays, or you've seen what's taking place now in the Caribbean, what happened in Guyana, only until the last administration. Obviously, government's now changed. You think, wow, is that where we are as people? Not as an ethnicity, but as human beings, that we are now looking to segregate ourselves based on the pigmentation of your skin, not about the value of the individual. Yet we'll still have corruption, we'll still have crime. No political party works for a whole group of an ethnicity. I think that's where people have been so stupid about. Reality is, when you win as a politician, you win for your friends as a politician. not for a whole community. And I think maybe South Africa has been a great example of that, where we've seen things like the Black economic empowerment policies come forward. It hasn't resulted in an upliftment of the entire community. It just made sure, as he rightly said, you've seen the income inequality just reach that ever bit more. What has to happen to change that then in your mindset? I know we're talking about policies, we're talking about but obviously that hasn't happened as of yet in the last 20 years, and worldwide it hasn't happened in the last 100 or 150 years. So knowing what we know from there, what are the radical steps that you would take based upon the experience that you've had to say, this is how we can start from ground zero. This is how we can shift the entire generation to be together, not having the dependencies on the government to do that. What would be your idea?
I'm going to use an example from my career at East Coast Radio. When I became managing director, CEO of the radio station, we were still very much a white radio station. And I said, and like I said, I was driven by purpose and a mission, which then obviously resulted in massive profitability as well. But that wasn't the driving force. The driving
force,
an
externality of
correct.
What you're doing, yeah.
The driving force was, how do we win trust? Because I know that this radio station can be the station for everybody in KZN, can be the rainbow station, as you called it. And at the time, that was very huge, the Rainbow Nation, etc. So we went about this with simple steps. Number one, first, we went into the Indian communities of Chatsworth and Phoenix. And we sat and listened to Indian people telling us what was important to them. I didn't go in and say, hey, you need to start listening to this radio station. Look, we've got a bunch of Indians working here now. Instead, we went in and we went to Umlazi and Kwamashu. These are the black townships. So we knew exactly where to go. And the first thing we did was we listened. We said, what are your biggest issues? Because we know they're not going to trust us straight away. Who are these people? The interlopers coming in and just, wanting us to listen to. Why should we? So the question was, what's important to you? And what was important to those people was, for example, in Umlazi, when we went in and listened to parents, they said, my children have nothing to do when they're finished with school. So they are vulnerable to the drug trade on the street corner.
Yeah.
What do you want? They said, can we not have something to entertain them every weekend? Because they've got nothing. There's no entertainment here. And that's why they're going to become gangsters and they're going to become drug addicts and they're going to drink alcohol. There's no entertainment. And we took a decision as the radio station not to throw up a billboard, not to waste money doing that sort of thing. We decided every weekend we would have a soccer tournament at the local field. We'd provide the ball, we'd provide the t-shirts, we'd provide everything that the kids needed. And all we would do is we would take a bus and go around that entire township with a loud hailer and say, come in this Saturday and play soccer together at this field. And that's how we won trust. We won trust by, number one, what do you really need? Not, hey, here's something we'd like to give you. Here's a handout. It was, what do you really need? What are the real problems in your community? Maybe we can help you solve them. Then we tied up with corporates and community organizations, and we started to provide those things that they said were most important to them. And when you lead with goodwill, doing the things that actually matter to the people, when you listen to what their real concerns are, and politicians do that all the time. They listen to the concerns for the benefit of the vote.
Yeah.
But what happens after the vote?
Yeah.
The thing with us was, just because they started to trust us, we could have shut shop and then stopped doing it. We carried on doing it until we could create some kind of sustainable way to ensure that those parents who told us their biggest fear about their young children, every weekend they knew there was something there, and it happened to be brought to them by East Coast Radio. And years later, when we were doing focus groups, and we would ask young Black professionals, when did you start listening to East Coast Radio? And they would say, when my mom told me that my younger brother was going down to a soccer tournament, and it was at the time Lungu, a white radio station, had just come in and was doing this thing for them every weekend. That's when I said, hey, what the hell are these white guys doing in my township? And I changed the radio station, and I suddenly heard, I thought that they played rock, but they weren't playing rock anymore. They were playing songs I could relate to.
Perfect.
So it's a microcosm, but it starts with listening and dealing with issues that really matter for these people, and then delivering on it. Because if you talk to anybody, if you talk to the president of our country today, he will tell you the biggest gap has been grand policy, zero execution.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, no, it makes sense. Look, I think this is remarkable because not only where you've come from, but the future of South Africa, the way that you see it. And you obviously have a book coming out soon as well, which I think will be a wonderful thing that we'll have on the site so people can see once it is released.
Yeah, it'll take time. I'm working on it. It takes.
You're still working.
Let me tell you, it's very, very difficult to write. You can get an inspiration and write 17 pages one day and 0 for the next week.
Absolutely.
So, but it will come out. It absolutely will. I'm determined.
Good. Well, Omar, do you know what? I think this has been a fantastic hour to have you on. Is there any final thoughts that you'd like to leave with the audience out there?
Yeah. There are 2 ways this can go when you are full of self-doubt. So the way I was brought up means that the first encounters I had, I walked in with very fragile, very vulnerable, with lots of self-doubt. You can take that doubt and look constantly, use your curiosity to find the answers to make you succeed. Whatever you are, whatever you're doing, don't allow that self-doubt to oppress you and make you into less of who you can be. Use it as a vehicle to improve. And in fact, I find that that's what, when I think back on my career, the fact that I was riddled with that self-doubt meant that I was always looking for better ways to do something. Because I always thought that the first way I thought of couldn't be good enough because I'm not good enough. But what else is out there? I mean, I remember through my entire career, I've always reached out to others all over the world, whether it's India or Germany or the Netherlands, you name it, to ask my peer group, how are you dealing with this? And often, if you're arrogant and you believe you have it all and the power is with you, you think you've got all the answers. But when you come from a place of self-doubt, you're constantly looking for new ways, new answers, if you harness it, because it can destroy you. But if you harness that doubt, it can be a force to make you and improve you and make you a better person.
I like that, using almost the aspects of intellectual curiosity that one has to have a look at the world, not as we are, but as it is. So therefore changing your lens, making sure you have empathy, and following the same footsteps as Omar, as yourself. The fact is that you did take off the layers of self-doubt later on in your career, and you made an active bridge to reach into communities and make a world of difference. You will never know how many people's lives you touched through the radio station, but more importantly, how many minds that you molded towards a better way of thinking. Omar, I think it's been a brilliant hour to have you on here. What I'll do, what a remarkable episode. I'm sure you agree. It's just fascinating to hear about these incredible journeys that as a community we've been through. People like Omar, what he's seen, what else it like for people of Indian origin in South Africa. There's monumental time. In some cases, it really does seem that we're forgotten from the history books at these times of adversity to have a look at, well, what did our community go through? What was it like for us? What are those stories that we too need to share? And that's why it's so important that we have the Global Indian series. As mentioned before, if you'd like to find out more about the work that we do, it couldn't be easier. Simply, if you listen to this via Podbean, make sure you share, like and comment. If you listen to this via YouTube, all you have to do is type in the Global Indian series. Likewise, on Instagram, you can check out the handle @the_Nazrans or Global Indian series. And now, you can have a listen to the entire repertoire on our soon-to-be-launched website, theglobalindianseries.com. There you can see all the work that we're doing, and more importantly, you can also get involved, get in touch, share your stories. Because the reality is, together we get to create a living encyclopedia about the communities and the experiences and the countries that we now call home. It's so important. I hope you did enjoy this session, and until next week, I hope you stay safe. Take care for now.